Imagine a prison where the inmates didn't pray for escape, they prayed for a bullet. In the summer of 1864, a simple wooden rail known as the dead line separated the living from the dead. But in Andersonville, starving, maggot-infested skeletons didn't fear this line, they crawled toward it with joy, begging the teenage guards to pull the trigger just to end the agony. This isn't just a story of war, it is the chronicle of an open-air cesspool where 45,000 men were left to rot alive in their own filth. Deep in the primitive pine forests of rural Georgia, where the towering trees should have offered cool shade and tranquility, the ground itself seemed to tremble with a silent, unending scream. It was the winter of 1864 when the axes first bit into the timber. If a curious traveler had decided to drive a spade into this cursed earth, they would not have uncovered tree roots or red southern clay. Instead, they would have struck a dense, geological layer of human suffering compressed into foul mud and forgotten bones. This place possessed no dungeon walls of cold stone, nor were there bars of tempered steel to cage the condemned. The only physical barrier was a crude stockade of pine logs, standing 20 feet high and blotting out the horizon, creating a wooden canyon of despair. Inside this pen, there were no barracks to shield the men from the fury of the elements. Under the blazing sun or freezing rain, the enclosure became a torture chamber, baking and freezing the inhabitants who burrowed into the ground like frightened animals. A heavy stench hung over the camp, a thick and oily miasma of decay that could be smelled for miles downwind. It was the suffocating scent of 30,000 men rotting while still alive, trapped in a space that was designed to hold only a fraction of that number. But the most terrifying barrier was not the massive wall that shut out the free world. Running parallel to the stockade, roughly 19 feet inside the logs, stretched a flimsy wooden railing that was barely raised above the filth of the churned ground. It was a crude assembly of slats known to the captors and the captives alike as the dead line. This fragile strip marked the absolute edge of existence, a demarcation where the faint hope of survival ended and immediate, violent nothingness began. To touch the rail, to stumble against it, or to step 1 inch beyond it was to sign a death warrant without trial. High above on the stockade, young sentries stood watch in their pigeon roosts, their muskets loaded, primed, and aimed at the strip. These guards were often mere boys, hardened by war propaganda and strictly ordered to kill without warning. Their eyes constantly scanned the perimeter, waiting for the slightest infringement from the mass of blue uniforms seething below them in the pit. The prisoners trapped within were no longer the proud men who had marched to war. They had transformed into macabre apparitions, skeletons draped in tattered rags, their skin stretched tight over protruding bones and covered in the sores of scurvy. Shuffling through the mire of their own waste, they were consumed by a hunger that devoured them from the inside out. Yet, as starvation clawed at their bellies and disease rotted their limbs, the dead line ceased to be a source of fear for the condemned. For many of these walking corpses, the forbidden strip of ground began to radiate a dark, magnetic allure. They looked at the railing not with terror, but with a profound and disturbing lust that defied the basic human instinct for self-preservation. In a world where breathing was a torture and waking up was a curse, the line offered the only commodity that had value. One deliberate step across that wooden slat meant the crack of a rifle and the piercing impact of a lead ball. It was a brutal deliverance, but it was a release from the slow, grinding agony that defined every second of life in Andersonville. Witnesses would watch in silence as a comrade, eyes vacant and spirit broken, would rise from the mud to make his choice. He would not run towards the wall in a futile attempt to escape. Instead, he walked steadily towards the dead line with the calm purpose of a pilgrim reaching a shrine, seeking the mercy that only a bullet could provide. There was no shout of defiance, only the dull thud of a body hitting the earth. For the thousands remaining in the pit, the death of a friend at the line was not a tragedy, but a moment of grim envy for the one who had finally escaped. By the time the humid heat of summer descended in 1864, the prison had ceased to be a military facility and had transformed into a catastrophe. The original plans, drawn up by Confederate engineers, had allotted space for 10,000 prisoners, a number that seemed manageable on paper. But the war was a voracious machine, churning out captives by the thousands from the battlefields of the wilderness and Spotsylvania, and the rail lines funneled them all to this single point in Georgia. The gates swung open daily to vomit forth new streams of blue uniforms, packing men into the enclosure until the ground itself seemed to disappear beneath them. The population swelled with terrifying speed, surpassing 20,000, then 25,000, before finally breaching 30,000 souls. The stockade became a grotesque city of the damned, more populous than many of the capitals of the states from which these soldiers hailed. Inside the log walls, the density of human bodies reached a critical mass that defied logic and sanitation. Each man was allotted a space hardly larger than a grave, forced to exist in a proximity that stripped away all privacy and dignity. There was no room to walk without stepping on a limb or a torso, and the simple act of moving from one end of the camp to the other became a journey through a labyrinth of misery. The overcrowding was so severe that when a man lay down to sleep, he was often touching 3 or 4 others, sharing their lice, their sweat, and their disease. The Confederate authorities, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of captives and crippled by their own failing supply lines, provided no barracks or tents. The interior of the stockade was a barren wasteland, devoid of any structure to shield the men from the elements. The Georgia sun became a weapon more potent than any bayonet, beating down on the exposed multitude with a relentless, hammering intensity. Temperatures soared, baking the sandy soil until it radiated heat like a kiln, scorching the skin of men who had long since lost their shirts and boots to gambling or theft. When the sun retreated, it was often replaced by torrential thunderstorms that lashed the camp with tropical ferocity. The rain did not cleanse the camp, instead, it turned the trodden earth into a quagmire of knee-deep mud that sucked the boots off men and coated everything in a slick, cold slime. To survive this exposure, the prisoners reverted to a primal state, mimicking the instincts of burrowing animals. Lacking tools, they used split canteens, tin plates, and their own bleeding fingernails to dig into the hard red clay. They excavated crude dugouts and holes, covering them with whatever scraps of cloth or blanket they had managed to retain. These pathetic shelters, known as shebangs, dotted the landscape like the mounds of a colony of giant termites, offering only the barest illusion of protection. Some men, too weak to dig or lacking the materials to build a roof, simply lay in the open, letting the sun blister their backs and the rain soak their bones. They huddled together in shivering piles during the chill of the night, sharing body heat in a desperate bid to keep their blood circulating. But the lack of shelter was a mercy compared to the horror of the water. Bisecting the camp from west to east flowed Stockade Creek, a sluggish stream that was intended to be the lifeline for the 33,000 men trapped within. Geography, however, had conspired with incompetence to turn this water source into a conduit of death. Before the stream even entered the prison walls, it passed through the camps of the Confederate guards stationed outside. There, the cooks for the garrison washed their pots and dumped their grease, and the soldiers used the water to bathe their horses and wash their uniforms. By the time the water trickled through the gaps in the stockade logs and reached the prisoners, it was already carrying a film of oil and refuse. Inside the prison, the situation descended into a nightmare of sanitation failure. The camp was situated on 2 opposing slopes, both draining downward into the swampy marsh that surrounded the creek in the center. With no organized sewage system, the thousands of men were forced to relieve themselves in the open, often too weak to reach the designated sinks near the water's edge. The rains washed this accumulation of human waste down the hillsides, channeling tons of excrement directly into the swamp and the slow-moving stream. The creek effectively became a massive, open-air sewer that bisected the living quarters. The surface of the water was often obscured by a thick, bubbling scum of grease, fecal matter, and rotting food scraps that had been discarded in the mud. Under the blazing sun, the swamp began to ferment, releasing bubbles of methane and a stench so overpowering that guards in the pigeon roosts high above would vomit from the fumes. This toxic sludge was the only water available for drinking, cooking, and bathing. The prisoners stood on the banks of this Stygian river, staring at the pollution with a mixture of horror and necessity. Their canteens were empty, their throats were parched, and the biological imperative to drink overrode every warning signal of the brain. They would wade into the muck, pushing aside the floating filth to try and reach the slightly clearer water in the center of the flow. But there was no clear water to be found, every drop was infused with the bacteria of thousands of sick and dying men. To drink from Stockade Creek was to ingest poison, a direct inoculation of dysentery, typhoid, and gangrene. Yet, as the temperature climbed and dehydration set in, men knelt by the hundreds along the banks, cupping the brown liquid to their cracked lips. They drank the very waste that they and their comrades had expelled hours before, completing a closed loop of infection. Within hours of drinking, the cramps would begin, bending strong men double with agony as their digestive systems collapsed. The latrines, located downstream, backed up as the creek flow dwindled in the summer heat. The sinks overflowed, merging with the marsh to create a vast, pulsating lagoon of excrement that covered nearly 6 acres of the camp's floor. This swamp became a breeding ground for billions of flies, which descended upon the camp in black clouds. They covered the food, the ground, and the faces of the men who were too weak to wave them away, laying their eggs in the open sores of the living. Maggots thrived in this environment, infesting the mud and the bedding of the prisoners. It was not uncommon for a man to wake and find that the insects had begun to consume his living flesh, cleaning wounds but also driving the victims to the brink of madness. The air was thick with the droning sound of these flies, a constant, low-frequency hum that served as the background noise to the moans of the dying. The pollution of the water and the soil was so absolute that a mere scratch could prove fatal. A small cut on a finger or a blister on a heel would inevitably become infected by the filth that coated every surface. Gangrene would set in with terrifying speed, turning limbs black and foul-smelling, necessitating amputations that were performed in the open dust without anesthetic. The camp doctors, overwhelmed and undersupplied, looked on in helplessness as the mortality rates skyrocketed. They knew that the root cause was not just the lack of medicine, but the environment itself. The prison was killing the men simply by forcing them to exist within it. Men who had survived the hail of bullets at Gettysburg and Chickamauga now wasted away from uncontrollable diarrhea. They became shadows of their former selves, their bodies consuming their own muscle mass in a desperate attempt to find energy. They stood by the creek, staring at the water that was killing them, knowing that they had no choice but to drink again. It was a slow, grinding attrition that stripped a man of his humanity before it took his life. The ground around the water source became a treacherous slide of slime, where men would slip and fall into the filth. Some, too exhausted to rise, simply drowned in the shallow, toxic sludge, their bodies left to bloat in the heat until a burial detail could drag them out. This was the reality of the summer of 1864. The camp had become a biological weapon, a place where the basic elements of life, water, earth, and air, had been turned against the people trapped within. There was no escape from the contamination. It was in the dust they breathed, the water they drank, and the mud they slept in. Andersonville had become a self-perpetuating engine of death, a giant cesspool under the open sky where 30,000 men rotted together. As the weeks dragged on, the boundary between the living and the dead began to blur. The men standing in the line for rations looked little different from the corpses stacked by the gate, waiting for the wagons to carry them to the trenches. In this kingdom of filth, survival was a lottery of the immune system, and for thousands of soldiers, the draw was fatal. They died not for a cause or a flag, but for a cup of clean water that never came. In the suffocating depths of this abyss, where the social contract had dissolved into the mud, the value of a human life plummeted until it was worth less than a single crust of moldy bread. The laws of civilization, which had held these men together on the drill fields and in the battle lines, evaporated under the pressure of starvation. For the 30,000 souls trapped within the stockade, the greatest threat no longer came from the Confederate sentries watching from the pigeon roosts. The guards, with their loaded muskets and cannon, were a distant, impersonal peril compared to the terror that began to rot the camp from the inside out. A malignant force rose from within the ranks of the prisoners themselves, a betrayal that cut deeper than any enemy bayonet. It was a brotherhood of predation, a structured gang of several hundred men who turned upon their fellow captives with a savagery that stunned the camp into silence. They called themselves the Raiders, a name that would become synonymous with the absolute nadir of human morality in the Civil War. These were not ordinary soldiers driven to desperation by momentary hunger. They were the dregs of the enlistment rolls, the professional bounty jumpers and street thugs from the violent alleys of New York and Chicago. They had enlisted not for patriotism, but for the cash bonuses, deserting and re-enlisting repeatedly until the war finally caught them. Now trapped in Andersonville, they brought the brutal code of the criminal underworld into a place where there was no police force to stop them. They banded together, recognizing that in a world of scarce resources, organization was the key to dominance. They carved out a territory for themselves on the south side of the stockade, erecting a large, comfortable tent that became known as the headquarters of their criminal empire. From this fortress, they launched a reign of terror that transformed the prison into a jungle where only the ruthless could prosper. Their targets were not the guards, but the weak, the sick, and most tragically, the newly arrived prisoners who were known as fresh fish. When the heavy timber gates swung open to admit a new column of captives, the raiders would be waiting. They watched the newcomers with the cold, calculating eyes of wolves sizing up a flock of sheep, looking for anyone who still had a blanket, a good pair of boots, or a watch hidden in their tunic. As night fell and the camp plunged into a darkness broken only by the cooking fires, the scream of "Raiders" would ring out, chilling the blood of anyone within earshot. It was the signal that the pack was on the hunt, moving through the sleeping rows of men with clubs, brass knuckles, and knives. They would descend upon a sleeping victim in a violent swarm, beating him into submission before he could wipe the sleep from his eyes. Hands would tear through pockets and rip away clothing, stripping the man of everything he possessed in a matter of seconds. If a prisoner resisted, the beatings were merciless and often fatal. A man might be bludgeoned to death for a pair of shoes, his skull fractured so that a raider could walk through the mud with dry feet. The cheapness of life was staggering. A murder could be committed for a few onions or a piece of salted pork. The rest of the camp, weakened by dysentery and starvation, lived in a state of paralyzed fear. They listened to the cries of their comrades in the dark, huddled in their holes, too terrified to intervene lest they draw the attention of the gang to themselves. The raiders grew bold with impunity, walking through the camp in broad daylight, pushing men off the paths and demanding tribute. They swaggered with the confidence of kings, their bellies full and their clothes intact, contrasting sharply with the skeletal figures that surrounded them. They corrupted the very idea of the Union cause, shattering the bond of soldiers who were supposed to be brothers in arms. To see a man wearing the same blue uniform slit the throat of a comrade for a blanket destroyed the morale of the prisoners more effectively than any Confederate victory. Trust evaporated entirely. Men began to sleep with their meager possessions tied to their bodies, clutching rocks or sharpened sticks in their sleep. The camp fragmented into isolated pockets of paranoia, where every stranger was a potential predator and every movement was watched with suspicion. The raiders monopolized the internal trade of the camp, controlling the black market with an iron fist. They bullied the sutlers who brought food to the gate, setting prices and taking a cut of everything that entered, effectively taxing the starvation of thousands. In their headquarters, known as the Big Shebang, they accumulated a hoard of plundered wealth. While men outside died for lack of shelter, the raiders slept on piles of stolen blankets and canvas, insulated from the damp ground and the biting winds. The ultimate indignity came at mealtimes, a daily display of injustice that fueled a deep, simmering rage. The majority of the prisoners were reduced to gnawing on raw ears of corn, their teeth loose in their gums, their bodies consuming their own muscle mass to survive. They would crouch in the mud, scraping the last kernels from the cob, watching with hollow eyes as the raiders prepared their feasts. The smell of frying bacon and brewing coffee would drift from the raider camp, a sensory torture for the starving multitudes. The bandits ate openly, laughing and gambling with stolen money, flaunting their stolen health in the faces of the dying. They had grown fat on the suffering of their countrymen, turning the prison into a microcosm of a society gone completely mad. It seemed that the bottom had been reached, that human decency had been extinguished forever in the Georgia clay. The strong preyed on the weak, and the weak died in silence, their bodies stripped naked before they were even cold, leaving nothing behind but the memory of betrayal. The Confederates, for their part, did little to intervene, viewing the internal strife as a way to keep the prisoners distracted and disorganized. As long as the Yankees were killing each other, they were not plotting escapes or uprisings against the garrison. But beneath the surface of this fear, a pressure was building, a desperate need for justice in a lawless place. The sight of the raiders growing stronger while good men wasted away kindled a spark of fury that was waiting for the right wind to fan it into a fire. The victims were pushed to the edge of what the human spirit could endure. They realized that if they did not act, they would all eventually fall prey to the wolves in their midst. The predators had mistaken the silence of the camp for submission, not realizing that they were pushing their victims toward a breaking point. In this hell, where God seemed to have turned his back, the prisoners were slowly coming to a grim realization. If there was to be any law in Andersonville, they would have to forge it themselves out of blood and violence. The feast of the raiders, with their stolen corn and looted gold, was not a sign of their permanent victory. It was the final insult, the catalyst that would soon turn the starving, trembling sheep into a pack of lions desperate enough to tear their tormentors apart. Even in the deepest recesses of the inferno, where the moral compass of humanity seemed to have shattered beyond repair, a spark of the old world flickered to life. The absolute anarchy that the raiders had unleashed upon the stockade finally triggered a reaction that was as inevitable as it was violent. The thousands of victims, pushed to the very brink of madness by hunger and fear, began to realize that no external savior was coming to rescue them from the predators in their midst. If order was to be restored to this festering pit, it would have to be forged by the prisoners themselves, using the only tools left to them, force and collective will. In the twilight shadows of the shebangs, a new whisper began to circulate among the most resilient of the captives, a password of resistance that moved from squad to squad. A group of men, led by sergeants who retained a ghost of their former authority, began to organize a counterforce known as the Regulators. They were a ragtag army within an army, composed of men who, despite the starvation, still possessed enough physical strength to swing a club and enough courage to stand against the knife. Their plan was desperate and dangerous, requiring a coordinated strike that could easily turn into a massacre if the raiders caught wind of it too early. But to reclaim the camp, they needed the sanction of the one man who held the ultimate power over their lives, the camp commandant, Captain Henry Wers. A delegation of the proposed police force approached the gate, shouting across the deadline to request a parley with the Confederate keeper. In a strange twist of fate, the jailer and the jailed found their interests aligned, as Wers had grown increasingly concerned that the internal chaos would lead to a mass riot that his guards could not control. He gave his tacit approval for the purge, agreeing to withhold his sentries as long as the prisoners policed their own. With the blessing of the enemy secured, the Regulators moved with the swift brutality of a military operation, launching their offensive in late June. Armed with wooden clubs, tent poles, and rocks, they descended upon the raider stronghold on the south side of the camp like a tidal wave of retribution. The battle that ensued was a vicious, close-quarters brawl fought in the mud and slime, a civil war compressed into a few acres of hell. The raiders, accustomed to preying on the weak and the sleeping, were caught off guard by the ferocity of organized men who had nothing left to lose. Skulls were cracked and limbs were broken as the Regulators tore through the raider encampment, ripping down the tents that had been bought with stolen gold. The air was filled with the shouts of combat and the dull thuds of wood striking flesh, as the accumulated rage of months was unleashed in a few furious hours. Dozens of the worst offenders were dragged from their holes, bloodied and beaten, and hauled to the gate to be held in custody by the Confederates outside the stockade. The seemingly invincible tyrants of the prison were reduced to whimpering captives, stripped of their power the moment the collective will of the camp turned against them. But this was not merely a riot, it was a deliberate attempt to reinstate the rule of law in a lawless place. The prisoners did not simply lynch their tormentors in the heat of passion, they demanded a trial, a spectacle of justice that would prove they were still civilized men. A court was convened within the prison, presided over by a jury of fellow prisoners who swore to weigh the evidence impartially despite their hatred. For days, the camp transformed into a macabre courtroom, where witnesses recounted the thefts, the beatings, and the murders committed by the gang. The proceedings were scrupulous, a surreal performance of due process amidst the stench of decay and death. While many of the lesser thugs were sentenced to run a gauntlet of vengeful prisoners, the 6 ringleaders were found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to hang. On the morning of July 11, 1864, the sun rose over a camp that was hushed with a terrified anticipation. Carpenters had been at work near the south gate, erecting a structure that had not been seen in Andersonville before, a sturdy wooden gallows with 6 nooses swaying in the stagnant air. Captain Wers, true to his word, allowed the construction and provided the lumber, acknowledging the verdict of the prisoner court. The 6 condemned men were marched through the gate, their arms bound, believing until the very last moment that this was merely a scare tactic to force a confession. They looked out at the sea of faces, 30,000 living skeletons packed shoulder to shoulder, a silent amphitheater of judgment. The crowd did not jeer, they watched with a grim, stone-faced intensity, witnessing the final act of a tragedy that had claimed so many of their friends. The condemned men, Collins, Sarsfield, Curtis, Delaney, Munn, and Sullivan, were led up the steps of the scaffold, their bravado crumbling as the reality of the rope became undeniable. A Catholic priest moved among them, offering final rites in the oppressive heat, his low murmurs the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Sacks were placed over their heads, cutting them off from the sight of the world they had tormented, leaving them alone with their terror. The tension in the yard was palpable, a physical weight that pressed down on the chest of every man watching, from the prisoners in the mud to the guards on the walls. At the signal, the trapdoor fell with a crash that echoed like a cannon shot across the silent camp. 5 of the bodies dropped and jerked, the rope snapping tight to break their necks or strangle them in a slow, macabre dance of death. But for one man, the notorious leader William Collins, known as Mosby, the rope snapped under his weight. He plummeted to the ground, still alive, gasping for air as the dust swirled around his broken form, offering a momentary, horrific twist to the proceedings. The crowd gasped, a sound like a sudden wind moving through the pines, as the regulators moved in to lift the dazed man from the dirt. There was no mercy in that pit, no divine intervention to spare him. He was simply hauled back up the steps, pleading for his life, to face the noose a second time. With a fresh rope secured, the trap was sprung again, and this time, the gravity of the earth claimed him without error. The 6 bodies twisted slowly in the humid breeze, casting long, thin shadows over the prisoners who had gathered to watch them die. For the thousands of spectators, the sight of their tormentors swinging lifelessly brought a strange, dark satisfaction. It was not happiness, there was no room for joy in Andersonville, but a profound sense of relief that resonated in their hollow chests. They had proven that even here, on the precipice of the grave, the concepts of right and wrong had not been entirely extinguished. The execution of the raiders was a brutal act, but it was an act that restored a fragile sense of order to the asylum. As the bodies were cut down and carted away to the burial trenches, the atmosphere in the camp shifted perceptibly. The fear of the night stalker evaporated, replaced by the grim, shared struggle against the elements and the enemy, united once more in their misery. The gallows stood empty against the sky, a wooden monument to the day when the dead men of Andersonville rose up to clean their own house. It was a victory of sorts, a reclaiming of dignity that allowed them to face their inevitable ends with their heads held high, no longer looking over their shoulders in fear. By August of 1864, the cycle of misery in Andersonville had reached its climatic zenith. The sun, hanging high in the Georgia sky, had ceased to be a mere celestial body and had transformed into a sentient executioner. It beat down upon the stockade with a relentless, hammering fury that seemed intent on baking the life out of the red clay. The heat was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that pressed the air out of the lungs and evaporated the moisture from the skin before it could even bead into sweat. The camp was no longer just a prison, it was a kiln, firing the 30,000 men trapped within until they were brittle and hollow. The worst casualty of this infernal season was the water, the single most precious commodity in the stockade. Stockade Creek, which had never been more than a sluggish, polluted ribbon, finally succumbed to the drought and the demands of the overcrowding. The flow of the stream slowed to a trickle, then stagnated entirely, leaving behind a black, viscous sludge that occupied the marshy center of the camp. It was a foul concoction of human waste, rotting food, and gray mud, baking under the midday glare until it formed a hard, cracking crust. Underneath this crust, the filth fermented, releasing bubbles of methane and decay that smelled of death itself. This was the only source of moisture for the multitude, a poison chalice that they were forced to drink from or face the agony of dehydration. Men crawled to the edge of this swamp, their tongues swollen to the size of fists, their lips cracked and bleeding. They pushed aside the green scum with trembling hands to scoop up the brown liquid, knowing that every swallow brought them closer to the grave. The connection between the water and the rampant disease was undeniable, yet the biological imperative to drink overrode all logic. As the water vanished, the death rate climbed vertically, turning the daily roll call into a grim accounting of the previous night's harvest. Despair began to curdle into a heavy, tangible madness that settled over the camp like a fog. Even the strongest men, those who had survived the raiders and the winter cold, found their resolve crumbling as their thirst drove them to hallucinations. In the evenings, strange sounds began to rise from the hovels and the holes dug into the hillsides. It was the sound of prayer, a collective, desperate plea rising from thousands of parched throats, begging for relief from a God who seemed to have abandoned Georgia. Revival meetings sprang up spontaneously in the dust, led by gaunt preachers who promised that deliverance would come if only the men kept their faith. They gathered in the twilight, swaying and chanting, their voices raspy and weak, asking for rain, for water, for anything to break the siege of heat. Then, in the middle of the month, the atmosphere began to shift. The heavy, oppressive air grew still, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on the arms of the prisoners stand on end. The sky turned a bruised shade of purple, piling up clouds that looked like anvils forged of iron. It was the herald of a southern summer storm, but this was no ordinary squall. The clouds towered over the stockade, blotting out the sun and plunging the camp into a premature twilight that hushed the murmuring of the 30,000 men. When the heavens finally broke, they did so with a violence that shook the earth. The rain did not fall, it was driven down in sheets, a deluge of biblical proportions that hammered the ground and instantly turned the dust into a churning river of mud. The wind shrieked through the pines outside the walls and tore through the camp, ripping the flimsy blankets and tent poles from the ground. Men stood naked in the downpour, opening their mouths to catch the falling water, laughing and crying as the cool liquid washed over their blistered skin. Thunder rolled like continuous artillery fire, a deafening barrage that drowned out the shouts of the guards. And then, in a moment that would be retold for generations, a blinding flash of lightning seared the eyes of everyone looking toward the deadline near the southwest gate. The bolt struck the earth with the force of a meteor, hitting a spot just beyond the deadline, past the reach of the prisoners. The ground seemed to explode, sending a geyser of mud and steam into the air, followed by a thunderclap that rattled the teeth of every man in the vicinity. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain hissing on the scorched earth. But as the storm raged on, the men nearest the strike zone noticed something miraculous happening at the site of the impact. From the furrow gouged by the lightning, a stream of water began to gush forth. It was not the brown, sluggish water of the swamp, nor was it the surface runoff from the rain. It was crystal clear, cold, and rising from the deep aquifers of the earth with powerful pressure. The water surged out of the ground, cascading down the slope and washing away the accumulated filth of months. It carved a clean channel through the mud, a lifeline of purity cutting through the heart of the corruption. The prisoners stood in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe what they were seeing. Then, a shout went up, a roar of disbelief and salvation that traveled faster than the wind. Men began to run toward the source, disregarding the guards, disregarding the mud. They threw themselves onto the ground, cupping their hands to catch the flow, splashing it onto their faces. It was sweet, cold, and pure, the finest water many of them had ever tasted, a stark contrast to the poison they had been surviving on. The guards on the walls lowered their rifles, seemingly paralyzed by the timing of the event. Even the most hardened Confederate sentry could not help but see the divine timing of a lightning bolt striking exactly where water was needed most, in the middle of a per-filled drought. The prisoners immediately christened it Providence Spring, believing without a shadow of a doubt that it was a direct answer from the Almighty. The spring flowed with such vigor that it was enough to supply the entire camp, changing the dynamic of survival in an instant. Lines formed, organized by the prisoners themselves, to collect the water. Men wept openly as they filled their canteens, feeling that perhaps they had not been forgotten after all, that there was still some mercy left in the universe. This spring saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives in the final months of the war. It hydrated the dying, cooled the feverish, and washed the sores of the scorbutic. It became a shrine, a holy place within the hellscape where men could restore a fraction of their humanity. But while the water could soothe the throat, it could not turn back the clock on the devastation that had already been wrought. The miracle of the spring was a balm, but it was not a cure for the systemic machinery of death that Andersonville had become. It could not flesh out the skeletons who were too far gone to digest food. It could not reverse the gangrene that had already turned limbs black, nor could it bring back the breath to the lungs of those who had perished in the mud before the storm broke. Just beyond the stockade walls, the reality of the camp's legacy lay in the silence of the earth. By this time, the death toll had reached a staggering magnitude, a number so large it became difficult for the human mind to comprehend. 13,000 men, fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands, had ceased to exist. The burial details worked ceaselessly, from dawn until dusk, yet they could barely keep pace with the rate at which bodies were carried out of the gate. There were no individual graves for these fallen soldiers, no coffins to house their remains. The sheer volume of the dead necessitated a method of disposal that was efficient, brutal, and devoid of ceremony. Long trenches were dug into the Georgia clay, stretching out in parallel lines like the furrows of a grotesque garden. The bodies were stripped of their uniforms, clothing was too valuable to bury, and laid into these ditches side by side. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, in a proximity that mirrored the overcrowding they had endured in life. Even in death, there was no space, no privacy, no room to rest alone. They were stacked in the earth just as they had been stacked in the stockade. The burial crews, often prisoners themselves on parole, worked with a numbness born of trauma. They placed a stake at the head of each man, marking a number that corresponded to a name in the death register, reducing a human life to a digit in a ledger. The soil was shoveled over their pale, emaciated forms, hiding the evidence of their suffering but unable to erase the memory of it. The red clay swallowed the army of ghosts, creating a vast field of mounds that rippled under the heat haze. Providence Spring continued to flow, bubbling up clear and cold, a symbol of life in the midst of a graveyard. But for the 13,000 in the trenches, the water had come too late. They remained in the dark earth, a silent testimony to the cost of a war where mercy had been the first casualty. The contrast was jarring and absolute, the living drinking from the hand of God while the dead slept in the neglect of men. The spring offered hope to those who remained, but it also served as a bitter reminder of the arbitrary nature of survival in this place. As the summer waned and the autumn approached, the water from the spring kept running, a constant sound against the backdrop of the camp. It was the sound of persistence, of life refusing to yield, even when surrounded by the most profound and overwhelming death. The spring of 1865 brought a silence to the pine forests of Georgia that was heavier than the roar of cannon fire. When the Confederacy finally collapsed and the heavy timber gates of the stockade were thrown open, it was not a moment of jubilant celebration, but a revelation of absolute horror. Union cavalry units riding into the sector to liberate the camp were stopped in their tracks, not by enemy fire, but by the sheer scale of the visual atrocity before them. They found themselves staring at walking corpses, men who had been reduced to biological husks, shuffling through a landscape that looked more like the surface of a dead planet than a military outpost. The soldiers who had fought through the bloodiest battles of the war, men who had seen the carnage of Antietam and Shiloh, wept openly in their saddles. They retched at the smell that rolled off the dying camp, a scent of rot so profound it seemed to cling to their uniforms for weeks afterward. News of the liberation spread north via telegraph and newspaper, carrying with it photographs that seared the conscience of the nation. These images of emaciated survivors, their ribs protruding like bird cages and their limbs no thicker than broom handles, ignited a firestorm of public outrage. The North, flushed with the victory of the war, suddenly found its triumph tainted by the realization of what its sons had endured. Grief instantly transformed into a blinding white-hot fury, a collective demand for retribution that required blood to wash away the stain of Andersonville. The public did not want explanations about supply lines or logistics, they wanted a villain, a monster in human shape who could be held responsible for this nightmare. They found their target in the camp's commandant, Captain Henry Wirz, the Swiss immigrant who had overseen the daily operations of the pit. Wirz was arrested in May 1865, dragged from his home while an angry mob chanted for his head. He was not treated as a prisoner of war but as a common criminal, a demon who had willfully orchestrated the starvation of thousands. He was transported to Washington, D.C., where he was paraded before a military tribunal in a trial that captivated and horrified the world. The capital was in a frenzy, with newspapers painting Wirz as the demon of Andersonville, a sadist who delighted in the suffering of his charges. The trial was less a judicial proceeding and more a theatrical purging of national trauma. Witnesses took the stand to recount tales of dogs tearing men apart and guards shooting prisoners for sport, piling the blame for every death squarely on the shoulders of the commandant. Wirz, suffering from old war wounds and racked with illness, lay on a chaise lounge during much of the proceedings, a pathetic figure who hardly resembled a monster. He pleaded that he was merely following orders, that he had begged his superiors for more food and supplies that never came. But his defense fell on deaf ears. The verdict had been decided by public opinion long before the gavel fell. On November 10, 1865, Henry Wirz was led up the steps of a gallows erected in the shadow of the U.S. Capitol dome. A crowd of hundreds had gathered, climbing trees and walls to get a better view of the dying moments of the most hated men in America. As the noose was placed around his neck, the soldiers guarding the scaffold began to chant, "Remember Andersonville," a mantra that drowned out Wirz's final protestations of innocence. The trapdoor swung open, and the body of the commandant jerked violently at the end of the rope. He did not die instantly, his neck did not break, and the crowd watched with grim satisfaction as he strangled slowly, his legs kicking in a final, futile dance against the air. With Wirz dead, the nation felt a sense of closure, believing that the ghost of Andersonville had been exorcised. The narrative was set. A cruel Confederate jailer had tortured Union heroes, and justice had been served by his execution. But the true horror of the story did not die on the gallows with Henry Wirz. It lay buried in the archives of the War Department, in the dusty correspondence and strategic memorandums that historians would later unearth and piece together with chilling clarity. As the emotional dust settled and the years passed, a darker, more uncomfortable truth began to emerge from the shadows of history. The overcrowding and the starvation in Andersonville were not solely the result of Southern cruelty or the collapse of the Confederate infrastructure. They were the direct, calculated consequence of a strategic decision made by the highest authority in the Union Army, General Ulysses S. Grant. In 1864, the system of prisoner exchanges, which had allowed captives to return home, was abruptly halted. The Confederates, desperate for manpower, had begged for the exchanges to resume, but Grant had refused. In a cold, hard assessment of the war's arithmetic, he realized that every prisoner returned to the South was a soldier who would return to the trenches to kill Union men. Grant wrote, with a terrifying logic, that it was cheaper to feed Confederate prisoners in the North than to fight them again on the battlefield. He argued that leaving Union soldiers to rot in Southern camps was a hard cruelty, but a necessary one to hasten the end of the conflict. He knew that the South could not feed its own armies, let alone thousands of prisoners, and he knew exactly what fate awaited his men in Georgia. By refusing to exchange them, he was deliberately condemning them to starvation, using their suffering as a weapon to bleed the Confederacy dry of resources. The 45,000 men in Andersonville were not just victims of the enemy, they were pawns sacrificed by their own commander in a game of attrition. They were kept in the pen to consume the South's limited food supply and to deny the Confederate Army reinforcements. This revelation reframed the entire tragedy, turning the narrative of victimhood into a story of betrayal. While Henry Wurz was demonized and hanged for failing to feed men he had no food for, the men who had the power to save them had chosen to let them die. The juxtaposition of their fates serves as the ultimate, cynical punchline to the war. Wurz, a mid-level bureaucrat who tried to manage chaos, swung from a rope as a war criminal, his name forever synonymous with evil. Meanwhile, Ulysses S. Grant, the architect of the policy that filled the mass graves, was hailed as the savior of the Union. He was showered with parades, elected president, and buried in a magnificent tomb, celebrated for the victory that his cold calculations had secured. The 13,000 dead in the Georgia trenches were the collateral damage of this winning strategy. They had looked north for salvation, praying for their generals to rescue them, never knowing that those same generals had locked the door and thrown away the key. The dead line at Andersonville was not just the wooden rail inside the stockade, it was drawn in Washington, on a map in a War office. The tragedy of Andersonville is not just that men died, but that their deaths were factored into the budget of victory, accepted as a reasonable price to pay. In the end, the story of the prison is a testament to the ruthless efficiency of modern warfare. It strips away the romance of battle to reveal the skeleton beneath, a numbers game where human beings are reduced to assets and liabilities. As the sun sets over the peaceful field that was once a hell on earth, the silence that remains is heavy with this knowledge. It is a silence that accuses the victors as much as the vanquished, echoing the eternal, bitter truth that in the pursuit of total victory, humanity is often the first thing to be surrendered.